Thank you everybody for attending this educational course. It is the case that my talk is a little bit different than the ones that we've been seeing. It was mentioned earlier that convolutional neural networks are inspired by the brain's visual system, but for most of the applications we've been looking at, that fact has been completely irrelevant. The only thing that matters is that they're good at processing images. But for the next 40 minutes or so, the fact that they're inspired by the brain's visual system is going to be very important. So to just really lay out the relationship between the brain's visual system and convolutional neural networks, I just want to highlight some of the features that they have in common. So you can see at the top a schematic of a convolutional neural network, and at the bottom is a schematic of the brain's visual system. And as you go through areas of the brain's visual system, starting mostly with V1 and going up through areas of the ventral visual pathway and the cortex, what you see are these two features, which is that the receptive field size of the neuron, so the area in visual space that a neuron responds to, that gets larger as you go through the cortical visual areas, and the features that the neurons respond strongly to get more complex. So in primary visual cortex, the neurons respond strongly to lines at different orientations. Then you have cells that respond to edges, up to full shapes and objects, and eventually things like faces. And so in the convolutional architecture, these features are built in because you have convolutions that make the input to a particular neuron at a layer be a function of some small area of the image space, and then we have pooling layers which makes that area in image space even larger because it sums or takes the max over a set of neurons which each have their own different space that they're responding to. And then layering these convolutions also makes the neurons respond to more complex features in the artificial system. So these two effects that we see in biological vision are built into the structure of convolutional neural networks. And there's a direct lineage from the work of Hubel and Wiesel and simple and complex cells. Those are represented as convolutions and pooling. And there's a model from the 80s called the neocognitron, which is kind of the link between the biology and modern convolutional neural networks. So if we're going to treat convolutional neural networks as a model of the visual system, what can we do with them? What can we compare to both validate that they're a decent model, as well as try to further our understanding of the brain by using them? So the two major things is that we can compare neural activity in the brain to the model, the activity of units in the model, and we can compare behavior, meaning the output of the model, how it classifies its inputs compared to how humans do the same thing, or animals. So when it comes to comparing neural activity between a network and the brain, there are two main ways to do it, but they both start with this same setup, which is basically that you have to show the model and a brain the same image. And so once you do that, you put the image into the model, you get all the activation of all the units in the model. That's easy. You show the image to, say, a monkey in a lot of cases, and you record from neurons in different areas in the brain. So here I'm showing a schematic where there's an electrode in V4, and you're recording the activity of a neuron, and then you can see how that neuron responds to different images, and it will presumably respond differently to different images based on the features that it prefers. So now you have activity of artificial units, and you have activity of real units. And one of the basic ways of comparing these is to just use the activity at a given layer in the network, use the activity of the artificial units to predict the firing rates of the real neurons. And you could presumably do this with voxels instead of neurons as well. And so that's just kind of simple linear regression. You show the same image, you get the artificial activity, and you use it to predict the real activity. And then you test the ability of the model to do the same on a separate test set. And when that's done, you're seeing here in black is the response of real neurons, and in red is the response of the prediction from the artificial units. And so it's for images of different objects. It's this strange image set where you have a three-dimensional object placed on a random background, and the images are ordered on the x-axis according to the object that it is. So you can see that there are certain neurons here that are responding very strongly for, I think it's this face data set that's in the middle. And then you can see that the red is a pretty decent match to the black, particularly at the very top line. And so this is showing different layers in a convolutional neural network, how well, if you use the activity of that layer, can you predict the activity of the real neuron. And so the top layer of the network is doing the best at predicting this data, which this data is actually from IT, not V4. And you can see also on the right here the different layers. This is how much variance they explain of neurons' firing rates. So this is for all the neurons rather than just this example neuron. And then the plot at the top is comparing the ability of using a convolutional neural network to do this prediction versus other models that have been used in the past to study the visual system. And you can see that the top layer of this convolutional neural network is performing much better at this task than any previously used model of the visual cortex. Another way to compare real neural activity to the activity that a model produces is through representational similarity analysis. And so this doesn't involve trying to predict any individual neuron's response. It's more comparing the way that two different models, or the brain in a model, represent the data set as a whole. So for this, what you do is you show, again, you show the brain and model the same images, and then you calculate for each thing, for either the brain area or the model, the correlation of the population activity in response to different images. So that's what you're seeing on the left here. So this is 1 minus the correlation, so it's the distance. So on the diagonal there would be 0 because it's the same image being shown. And then this is it produces kind of like a barcode or a signature of how different areas represent different images. So you can see at the top I'm showing visual cortex, and visual cortex there's not a lot, early visual cortex like V1, there's not a lot that you can see in the structure based on the way that the images are ordered. But for the fusiform face area, it's clear that that area represents faces and bodies very similarly because that's what's in this upper quadrant. Those are all the face images, and it's representing them very similarly to each other. So this just forms this signature of how each area represents different images, and then you can ask, are two brain areas doing it the same way, or alternatively, are two models doing it? Is the brain and a model doing it the same way? So to do that, you just take these matrices and you just take the correlation of their upper triangle as a measure of how similar the matrices are. And so when you do that, you can see here on the top there's a bunch of these matrices for different models. So the first two are models, and then we have V4 neural data and IT neural data, and then a convolutional neural network is at the end there. And so you can even just by visually looking at this, you can see that the convolutional neural network looks pretty similar to the way that IT is representing images. And then in the bar graph on the bottom here, there's an explicit comparison. And so the black bar that's the highest is if you just split IT into two populations and compared it, so that is the best match. The second black bar is if you compare V4 to IT, and you can't do as well comparing V4 to IT as you do comparing this model to IT. And then again, you can see here that the layer that you're looking at in the network matters for what you're comparing to in the brain. So on the left, we're looking at early visual cortex. This is using fMRI data, so it's human V1 to V3, and the earlier layers in the network are a better match to that data. Whereas if we're using human IT, you want to use later layers in the network. So there's just correspondence between areas in the visual pathway and layers in the network. So comparing behavior is, again, it's just as you would expect. You have to have the model and the human or the animal do the same behavior. So it's usually this kind of classification task where you show an image and then they have to respond with what object class they think that image is in. And for this, you can use these confusion matrices to compare the model in the brain or in the behavior of a human. And so these are representing how likely the respondent is to categorize an object as a different object. And then these are arranged in a way so this red block up here is showing a lot of confusion. Different categories are being confused, and these are all categories of tools, I think. Yeah, it's like a wrench and a knife and a fork. And so those are kind of similar objects, and this is human and monkey behavior, so it makes sense that they get confused. And then the question is, will a model have the same confusions, or will it even if it has the overall same accuracy, it could be getting that in different ways. So you want to know if it's confused in the same way. And this is showing that many of the major convolutional neural networks are confused in the same way as humans and primates are on this task. You can also compare behavior by looking at how the models fail. And so in this, I'm just showing an example of adding noise, pixel-wise noise to the images, or blurring them, so kind of decreasing the resolution. And this is a situation where the models are a little bit different than human data, because you can see humans are actually pretty robust to these types of perturbations, to adding pixel noise and to blurring, whereas the model performance kind of falls off pretty quickly as you do that. Another example is this test where they kind of remove information about the image, either removing color or removing the detail of the texture and just showing a silhouette. And you can see that those perturbations do decrease the human performance. That's the gray lines on this plot, but they decrease the model performance much more. Okay, so now I want to talk about attention, because that is what I study and what I use these models to understand. But it requires a lot of definitions because it's used a lot in a lot of different ways. It has different definitions within neuroscience. It has another set of definitions within psychology, and then yet again within machine learning. So I'm going to talk briefly about what people mean when they say attention in machine learning, and then I'm going to talk about what it is in neuroscience. So when using convolutional neural networks, a lot of times the word attention refers to this sort of spatial attention, where what the model processes next will be a function of what it's already processed, and it will get to choose a spatial location in its input image. So in this example, I'm showing a model where the first thing that you give to the model is a coarse, kind of zoomed out image, and then it gets sent through the model like normal, but rather than just offering a classification, so like what bird is this, there's part of the model that is read out as a way to say what part of the image it wants to see next. And then based on this readout, the model then gets as input a zoomed in version of the location that it requested. And so the model has to learn the best parts of the image to zoom in on in order to do this classification. And this is a particularly difficult classification task because it's classifying different species of bird, and so you might need to know, oh, in this case, the tail is more informative than the beak or something like that. So this is showing a model where basically through recurrent processing steps, the model chooses where it wants to look next. Another example, which we saw earlier, is it's a similar example, but it's not this case where you get finer and finer resolution or zooming in. It's more just what part of the image does the network want to enhance the representation of. And so in this example, again, there's a first pass where the image is inputted, and then because the goal of this particular network is to output a caption, at each word that it outputs, it might want to take in a different part of the image. So in this case, you can see that as it's outputting the words, the underlined word is the word that's currently being outputted by the model as the caption, and you can see that the spatial location of the image, the part of the image that the network is upweighting, is where the frisbee is, which is the word that it's producing. So in all of these, or in this case, the attention can be thought of as kind of differential weighting of its own input. It wants to pay more attention to this part of the spatial location, and so those inputs are scaled up. So that's attention in convolutional neural networks. There's also attention when in machine learning when doing language translation, which is somewhat similar in the sense that it's an upweighting of certain parts of the input sentence when the model is producing its output sentence. But most of the time in convolutional neural networks, the type of attention that is used is this spatial attention, where you're focusing on different parts of the input image. And there is spatial attention in the brain and studied in neuroscience, of course. The most obvious is just making saccades. So that's kind of similar to the bird example, where you kind of get a coarse image and then you might think, oh, I want to look more in detail. And so you foveate, and your fovea has higher resolution. So that happens. There's also covert spatial attention, where you don't have to move your eyes, but you can make part of your visual input more salient. But for the rest of this, I'm going to be talking about feature attention, which is slightly different. And so let me just explain kind of the experimental setup that can be used for feature attention. So what it is that usually there's the start of a trial, and then there will be some sort of cue that's given to the participant. In this case, these are human participants, and so that the cue that they get is in the form of a word like pumpkin, or they might not get any cue. They might just hear a white noise stimulus. And then they are shown an image that's kind of flashed somewhat briefly before their eyes, and it's also a very noisy image. So you can see it's kind of got all these squiggles and stuff. But underneath it, there actually is a drawing of a pumpkin. And then at the end, they'll be asked some sort of question about what they saw. They might be asked if they saw a pumpkin, which would be the word that was cued, or they might be asked about a different object. And so the point of this is to say, if you're cued about the thing that you're going to be asked about, are you better at detecting it? Because in the normal situation, this is a pretty hard task because these images are so noisy. So what you're seeing on the bottom is that when you are validly cued about what you're going to be asked about, the hit rate is higher. So you do detect correctly the presence of the object when you're cued about it, and also response times decrease. So this is the benefit that comes from deploying attention. These are the behavioral benefits or the performance benefits that come from deploying attention. This feature-based attention, because you're attending to a type of object, not to a particular location in visual space. Okay, so looking at the activity of neurons when an animal usually is performing this task, you can see that, so basically if you just look at the responses in the absence of attention, when there's no there's no cue, there's no information about what to attend to, just naturally different neurons or different parts of the brain will have different preferred stimuli. So images that when that image is on, the neuron is firing strongly, and they will have other images where they don't respond strongly to. And so those are non-preferred or the least preferred stimuli. And so just we can just talk about that kind of information as a tuning curve, where the tuning curve represents the response of neurons to different stimuli, and there will be some stimuli that they respond strongly to and some that they don't. So there's a model of attention based on neural data that says that attention modulates the firing of a neuron in a way that depends on its tuning curve, in a way that depends on its normal response. And the way that that would look is that the stimuli that the neuron prefers, when that feature is being attended, those neurons have increased firing. And the stimuli that the neuron doesn't prefer, when those features are being attended, it decreases the neuron's firing rate. So under any circumstance, the thing, according to this model, which is called the feature similarity gain model, whatever is being shown, the neuron's firing rate will be higher than average if it is attending, if it was cued to its preferred feature, and lower than average if it's attending or was cued for something it doesn't like. So it changes each neuron differently based on these properties. Okay, so we've talked about how convolutional neural networks can be used as a model of the visual system because they are structurally similar, and the representations that they learn end up being similar to the representations in the brain. And now I've just introduced this concept of attention. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to be going over this work where basically we tried to bring attention into convolutional neural networks, a form of attention that's inspired by the brain. Okay? So to start, I just used a standard convolutional neural network architecture, which is VGG16, and this is an architecture that was trained on the ImageNet task, which is the normal task that's used to train these networks. And so the network is given an input image, and it needs to categorize it into one of 1,000 categories as the output. But as I was explaining with the pumpkin example, in order for the effects of attention to be seen, you need to present the subject with a challenging task. And so for that, I'm going to present the network with these images, which is not what it was trained on. There's two different types of images, either these merged images, which take two of the normal images and overlay them transparently, or put four of the normal images on one on each quadrant. And so these are more challenging images for the network because they contain multiple objects. But now, because there's multiple objects, it's not fair to ask the network what category is this, because there's multiple categories. So I won't be using the 1,000-way classification, but instead I'll be using a binary classifier for each category. So just asking, is there a clock in this image? And so for both of these, the model should say yes. And so this is just to show that this is challenging for the model. So this is the binary classification performance for each category on just normal, regular images that just have one object. And then when you put in these more challenging images, the performance goes down. So this is a great place for attention to have an effect, for attention to bring that performance back up. Okay, so how do I translate the findings from the neural data about what attention does to neural activity into this network? So as I said, this model of attention says that the way a neuron is changed with attention is a function of how it normally responds. It's a function of its tuning. So what I had to do is first show the network a bunch of regular images and get a tuning curve for the different categories. So I'm showing here just 20 different categories that I used, and then on the y-axis is a measure of the response of artificial neurons to those different categories. And what I'm doing is I'm averaging over each of the feature maps. So each of the feature maps is the result of applying a single filter to the layer below, and just the result of that filter at each spatial location. So I'm assuming there's filters that kind of like pumpkins and filters that don't, and so I'm just averaging spatially to get a tuning curve for each feature map. So just the response of each feature map to different object categories. And then that will tell me how each feature map's activity should be modulated when I'm applying attention to that category. So you can see, for example, if I wanted to apply attention to the last category in this plot, for the feature map on the top here, that feature map has a positive tuning value, so that means it prefers that category. So its input-output function here would be scaled upward. So I'm just using the standard in black is a normal rectified linear unit. That's what these models use. But I want now, when I apply attention, for the firing rate of that feature map to be higher than it would normally. So I just increase the slope of that input-output function for that feature map. For the feature map down here, it slightly dislikes the category that I'm attending, so its slope will be scaled downwards. And then that's kind of the direction and the relative amount. The tuning tells you that, and then there's this overall parameter called beta, which is just how much are you scaling everything. Okay, so I can do this at each layer in the network, this scaling up or down based on the tuning of the feature maps. And what you're seeing here is the increase in performance that comes from doing this, the increase in binary classification performance. So if the model needs to attend to clocks, and I'm putting in images, these weird, difficult images, and some of them have clocks and some of them don't, the attention applying at different layers in the network can actually make the network better at doing that task. And you can see here that the layer that the attention is applied at really matters, and later layers in the network, applying attention there increases the performance much more, which is somewhat in line with the fact that the neural effects of attention are seen more in and more strongly in later areas of the visual system rather than earlier areas like V1. And then looking in more detail at how the performance changes, we can break it down into true and false positive rates. So true positives just being the network says there is a clock when there is a clock. False positives, it says there is a clock when there isn't a clock. And so what you're seeing here is as I increase this beta parameter, the overall strength of attention in the model, you get an increase in both the true and the false positives. But the true positives are increasing more than the false positives, and that's how you get an overall increase in performance, because you're affecting the true positives, you're increasing your correct answers at a rate that's higher than you're increasing your incorrect answers. And if we compare that to data, these are examples where you can compare the case where the subject was cued for the object it would be asked about versus when it wasn't. So without attention and with attention, attention does experimentally increase both true and false positives. So this is a way in which the model is matching the behavioral data. Okay, so I have a small code demo that kind of replicates this project that I just talked about in a miniature form. So I'm going to switch to that. So the version that I'm going to do here doesn't use the full ImageNet BGG16 data set. Instead, we're going to train a small convolutional neural network to do the MNIST classification, which is classifying handwritten digits to say what digit was written. And so I've already loaded the data that I need for that. And then and so then I'm going to kind of define the architecture of the model, and the model will train very quickly because it's very small. And then, maybe I didn't load these things. And so the task that we're going to do is slightly different as well. It's not going to be these images that are merged and overlaid, but it will be noisy versions of the normal images. Okay. Okay. So here is just some basic functions that help build the network. So we're going to need to use weight variables and bias variables. And I should say I'm using TensorFlow, which is different than the previous presentations. And then the main thing that's different about the architecture of this network compared to a regular convolutional neural network is just that I have to include a way to put in the attention signal when it comes time to do that. And I can speak more about that in a moment. But like you can see here, so we're building the network. The first layer is going to have 32 feature maps. So 32 filters that will be applied to the input image, and then 64 filters that will be applied to the first layer to form the second layer. And then the third layer is fully connected, and it has 1024 units. And so the main difference here, so you can see the code for building the network is just you string together these different components. So there's a convolutional layer, a pooling layer, convolutional layer, and so on. But I have to put in these, I'm calling them T-vals, they're tuning values. They're the information about how the different feature maps prefer different, in this case, digits. And there's warnings because this is an old version of TensorFlow that I wrote this in. Okay, and so this is defining the loss function. So for the normal training, we're just doing the normal task here, which is to categorize the digits. So this is an example of what the input looks like. It's just these handwritten digits, and then the task of the network is to output the digit that is in the image. So it has 10 possible outputs. And now we'll start training the network. I'm training until the validation accuracy is at least 95%, or there's some batch limit that's reached. And so we can see here, just this is the training curve of the validation accuracy. So it trained fine. And okay, so now this is where it becomes different than normal convolutional neural networks. So as I said, in order to know how to apply attention in the network, we need to know how the feature maps in this network normally respond. And so for that, we need to make the tuning curves of the network. And so basically, it's obviously very easy compared to biology to record from units in these networks. So I just have some functions here that just find the relevant activity in the network. So I'm going to record from the first 3 layers in the network, the first 2 convolutional layers and the fully connected layer. And so I just feed them in normal images. We're still working with the normal data set. And then based on knowing the labels of each of those images, I can just say this is the average response of this feature map to the digit 0, this is the average response to 1, and so on. And so we can look at what these tuning curves look like. So these are some example tuning curves. This is for the first layer. So on the x-axis is the digit. Yeah, on the x-axis is the digit, and then on the y-axis is a normalized measure of the response that each of these, so these are all different feature maps. And so you can see that there are some digits that different feature maps prefer, and some digits that they don't prefer. So there's, aside from this fact that, and this happens a lot in these networks, almost none of the feature maps respond strongly to the digit 1, perhaps just because it's kind of very basic. It's just a line, so there's not a lot of features to grab onto. But other than that, there's diversity amongst the feature maps. They have different digits that they each prefer or don't prefer. And then we can look also at the other layers. So the second layer looks somewhat similar. In the third layer, things start to get a bit more selective. So you might see stronger differences between a preferred digit and a non-preferred. So this layer has kind of more information about digits, potentially. Okay. So yeah, as I said, we're not doing the exact same task for the attention. Instead of overlaying images, I'm just going to make these normal images really noisy, which is kind of the same thing that was done in the example with the pumpkin and the drawing. So I'm just going to make the images really noisy and see if the network can still classify it correctly. And I'm going to make a particular data set to test it on where the first half contains the digit that we're going to apply attention to, and the second half of the data doesn't. So it'll just be really clear if it starts to perform better on the first half or the second half. So that's how we'll calculate the true and false positive rates. So So here I'm just making the noisy images. So this is an example, this is the level of pixel-wise noise that we're working with. And so I've set it here that we're attending to the digit 4. And I'll be applying attention at the second convolutional layer in the network. But so this, you know, I think we can see there's probably a 4 in it, but if it were flashed very quickly in a psychophysics experiment, it might be harder to tell. This is also an example of a digit that is in the second half of the test set. This is the digit 9, but with the noise it kind of looks like a 4. So you can see how this amount of noise can actually make the task quite challenging. And so again, we have a challenging task and we want to see if attention can increase performance on that. Okay, so in this loop, I'm going to apply attention. I said I've chosen to, in this case, apply it at the second convolutional layer. And I'm going to apply it with increasing strength so that we can make these curves that map out the performance based on true and false positives. And so I'll just run this here. And I'm printing the outputs so we can even just visually look at this. So we know that the first half of these images, it is the digit 4 that is in the image, and the second half it is not. And you can see that this network is, you know, there are kind of a lot of 4s scattered about the first half and maybe fewer in the second half. But as the strength of attention is increased, so that's the number on the left is the strength of attention, we can see that more and more 4s are becoming clear in the first half. And so what I'm showing here is the true and false positive rates. And so you can see that as we increase the strength of attention, the true positives are increasing very strongly in blue there, and the false positives don't even increase until attention is quite strong already. And so if they were increasing in unison, so I'm plotting on the right here, I'm plotting the change from the 0 attention condition, so you can see very clearly how to compare these. If they were both rising together, then there wouldn't be a net increase in performance because you'd be reducing one type of error, but you'd be increasing another type of error. What's important for the ability of attention to increase performance overall is this fact that the true positives are increasing much more than the false positives. So that is the end of my demo. Thank you. Doing questions?
So we do have additional time for questions now. I'm going to invite the speakers from previous talks, those of them who are here at least, to come back up. And if you have any questions about, first of all, Grace's talk, and then answer questions about the other talks as well.
No, they're on. Can we turn the microphones on?
In the last example, the base rate of the 4s and the non-4s was half and half. But in a natural setting, it would be like 1 to 9. So the false negatives, the false positives would harm you more if the base rate changes. Is that true?
Yeah, it's possible that obviously the overall change in performance depends on how balanced the test set is. To me, I think you wouldn't be applying attention. The circumstances under which you're applying attention might depend or might be related to the test set conditions, and so that's relevant. But you would still, if you are looking for 4s and they're rare, you would still increase the amount of times you would notice a 4, but you might see 4s when they're not there, and depending on what you care about, if it's more important that you see them when they're there, it doesn't matter that you hallucinate, then you would still want to apply attention in that case.
Hi. Much of the neuroscience literature, especially in functional MRI, revolves around questions of multiple comparisons, statistical significance, and how to convince yourself that you're looking at real effects. I was wondering what your thinking is about this in the context of comparing artificial neural networks to neuroscience data, where you might look at completely different scales. You said that one could apply these techniques both to neuronal data or to voxel fMRI, but you're comparing the quote-unquote signals from tens of thousands of artificial neurons to potentially tens of thousands of voxels in the brains or neurons. So what does it mean if you find individual signals that correlate?
Well, the representational similarity analysis is meant to be kind of a comparison between two populations that relies mainly on how those populations within themselves represent different things. And so, I mean, I'm sure that the ability to find strong representations depends on how much data you have, but I don't know that that's impacted by the fact that you might have more voxels versus artificial units or vice versa, because the first step is to reduce all of that data into this matrix, and then that's the thing that's compared. And then also you're just comparing that to other models that attempt to explain the same data, so it's just a relative kind of who's better at doing that. And I don't know if, so for that within comparison, obviously if you're comparing one model that's very small and doesn't have a lot of opportunity to produce different representations, and that's not a fair comparison. But otherwise, I don't know if it's a problem.
Right, but if you compare 10 or even 100 different artificial neural network models and you find one that's better than the others, does that mean that you're close to something that represents the real thing?
I mean, I think it's an indication that you're on the right track. Ideally, you find principles that matter. So a big thing in this literature is it really matters what the training data is in terms of getting representations that match the brain. ImageNet is pretty good. If you want to do really well on matching fusiform face area, you want to use a face data set to fine-tune the representations. So that's the principle that's come out of these comparisons. It's not just saying, oh, this one model did really well and we're not going to like investigate why.
But what do you make of the fact that neural network models of vastly varying structure can perform the same tasks equally well?
They don't all predict neural data equally well, and when you get into these really deep ResNets, they stop predicting neural data as well as like BGG16, which is considered shallow in comparison to these very deep ones. So it is important that there's this break between just the networks that do the best for the purposes of image processing and the ones that represent neural data the best. They're not exactly aligned.
Thank you.
Okay. First, in comparing behavioral research, one means DCNN, just deconvolutional network.
Why not use what? Sorry?
One means DCNN in comparing behavior slide.
We're comparing the behavior between the convolutional neural network and the human performance. Yeah.
Okay. And the other question is, in the comparing behavior research, how can you make RSA metrics? So my question is, can you tell me a more detailed process?
For comparing the behavior?
Yes.
It depends on exactly what you're asking, but it's usually just this idea of having the network perform the same task as the animal, which is usually a categorization task. And then you want to know, is it making the same type of errors, rather than just is the overall percent correct the same. But when it does something wrong, does it do something similar to what a human would do? Does it confuse the same categories? That's a big element of it. Is it particularly focusing on comparing the types of errors that are made?
no further questions, we can adjourn and return back at 1 p.m. for the afternoon session.